Please, first of all, forgive the slight delay. I haven't figured out how to remote set my camera yet. Yesterday I posted 10 questions concerning 9/11. The object of the 10 questions was to put at the centerpiece of a discussion the kinds of the facts which are critical to the administration's narrative and are critical to the events that happened on that day to determine whether or not the narrative fits the agenda and the statements of the actual occurrence of the events. So let me just go through the questions, and then we'll talk about, during those questions, I'll talk about some of the things that I've observed and how they fit into it. So without further ado, the first question I asked was how many Arabs identified as commandeers of the 4 flights were on the boarding list and were publicly shown on the airport security videos, and the answer is 0. I had given the opportunity to say 19, 15, and 4, but it is 0. And there is a video showing 2 of the alleged hijackers boarding, but they're boarding in Maine, and they're boarding in preparation to go to Boston that morning a few hours before their flight, their claimed flight to get on the Boston flight, the Boston outbound flight. So there are none of them shown, and there was no listing of them on the boarding list, which calls into question how they were identified in the first place. So they were identified within 24 or 48 hours after 9/11 by then FBI Chief Mueller. The same guy that's the special prosecutor now. And there were 19 pictures posted. The names of all of these 19 alleged hijackers were given. They were shown to be of various Arab descent. And my first question, of course, is if they knew within 48 hours who those folks were, why weren't they watching them 2 days earlier? And the second question is how many of them were actually part of the 19 and part of the conspiracy that is part of the narrative put out by the administration? And the answer to that is that there are at least 7 or 8 of them who were identified as still being alive after 9/11, still and not in the country at the time. They were in various parts of the world doing other things, and the 7 or 8 of them got a hold of various embassies throughout the world and said, you know, you posted my picture and name and it couldn't possibly be me because I'm here. So question number 2. I will save this one for last. Actually, I have a reason for doing that. Question number 3. How many were on the airlines? Let's see. How many Arab terrorists identified on 9/11 were on the 4 airlines? And the question is, and this relates to question 1, the passenger lists are not there. What happened to them? No bodies found, nothing anywhere, even at Shanksville. So they are clearly not part of the process. Question number 4. How many of the commercial airlines on 9/11 hit the targets? And the clear response is obviously one of those 4 did not hit a target. It crashed allegedly at Shanksville and created a pit there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But also the other 3 allegedly hit targets on the north and south towers of the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon. And so the narrative which conforms to the administration would be that 3 of them hit their target. But the question then is whether or not that's the case. And obviously, if you look throughout YouTube, you will find many respondents there, many videos posted that say that that's not the case. I think it's fairly clear that whatever hit the Pentagon is not an airliner and was not the flight that was there. And I can say that because the plane, the radar, and the postings of the progress of that object were much too fast to be a plane. It cruised in a wide, flat arc. It approached the Pentagon, I think, from the south or the east. It was flat and level with the ground for a quarter or half mile. It was going at an exceedingly fast rate of speed. It was 10 feet or so off the ground. It knocked down 5 or 6 light posts. An airplane could not have done that. Whatever hit the Pentagon, and you can see, if you're careful and you look, you can see the first pictures of it show a round hole into the Pentagon, not the big collapse that is shown an hour or so later. But the immediate picture shows a round hole going into the Pentagon. And that round hole is what, 15, 18, 20 feet tall. And the crash site is 20 or 30 or 40 feet narrower than the airline would be. Not only that, all of the debris that should be left outside of that 18 or 20 foot hole, including parts of the cabin, the fuselage, the tail, both the extended ends of the main wings, none of that was there. The landing gear is not there. The landing gear would not, of course, disappear. 2 largely tungsten-based 600 or 700 pound, I don't know, maybe much more than that. Engines were not there. Only part of them were there. So it's pretty clear that that's not the case. It's a little difficult to tell by the North Tower. I'm sure there are people with much more knowledge than I have that can be definitive about it. But as it relates to the South Tower, the radar and the videos that are shown with the airplane, the object approaching the South Tower, show it as making a very fast, tight, at least 90-degree turn and coming around into the South Tower at something in excess of 500 miles an hour. To be very clear about it, it is impossible for that airplane to be traveling at 500 miles an hour at sea level. Number 2, it's impossible at 500 miles an hour at sea level to make the turn that it would have made. Number 3, if you look at the videos, there are 2 or 3 things which are obvious. One is that it appears to be a dark object, a dark plane, and obviously the airliner was not. It appears to have no markings on it, and of course the airliner did. And it appears to have a huge belly tank, which of course no commercial airlines do. So one of the other questions I have will elucidate further some of the problems with that South Tower approach. And obviously the fourth is the Shanksville one, and again, there are no bodies. First of all, there is no appreciable aluminum there, and it would not have been consumed. There are no landing gears, there are no engines, there are no tail sections, and there were no bodies found. And the the county coroner in Pennsylvania that went out there said it obviously was not a place for him to find bodies. So how did that work? Well, make up your own mind. But it's a difficult concept to match the narrative of the administration to fit any one of those 3 scenarios into their narrative. Number 5, how many steel tall buildings in the World Trade Center fell on 9/11 as a result of being hit by an airliner? Well, my first answer, the options are 4, 3, 2, and 0. The clear answer from the administrative narrative is that 2 of them did. One was the North Tower and the other the South Tower, which leaves open the question, of course, as to whether or not the North and South Tower were actually hit by airliners or hit by anything that approached being an airliner and shows the characteristics of having been an airliner. But there's a trick question to this, and that is that there was a third tower which fell, a 47-story building number 7 in the World Trade Center, which fell, which was not hit by an airline. And all three of these steel buildings collapsed within hours of the occurrence, which of course is the administrative narrative. It does not conform to the facts, however. Number 6, how many of the World Trade Center buildings collapsed for other reasons? And the question then is 4, 3, 2, or 1. Well, it wasn't 4, there were only 3 that collapsed. Was it any of the 3 that collapsed for reasons other than an airline crash? And the obvious first answer is yes, of course, one of them did. Most of us forgot, and the narratives of the commission, of the 9/11 Commission, totally ignored the collapse of World Trade Center number 7, but most of the official administrative folks also ignore it, and the reason for it is that a 47-story building collapsed without having been hit by an airline, and it collapsed perfectly into its own footprint. It collapsed uniformly from one side to the other. It collapsed from the center out, which is indicative of a demolition, and it had only been subject to some minor damage in the corner of it and to a localized fire, which if there were going to have been any kind of collapse, it would have collapsed from that corner and probably only collapsed at in a tiny place. But in any case, the likelihood is that none of them collapsed as a result of being hit by an airline, and even if the objects which hit the 2 towers, the 2 tall towers, 1 and 2, north and south, caused extensive damage, which of course they did, they would not have caused the collapse of those towers. And we'll see that for other reasons. Number 7. The Pentagon has provided ample video evidence of the American Airlines Flight number 77 attack. And the response then is, how many pictures have you seen? Well, there is a 1 or 2 video screen picture of some kind of object in tight view with a 50-foot extension perhaps out from the building, showing some object smashing into the building. It is clearly not enough to tell us that flight number 77 hit the Pentagon. And what you should be aware of is that the FBI collected all of the citizen or civilian videos that might have been taken, security cameras from across the street at the service stations and other places. There are hundreds of cameras, as you might know, in the Pentagon, perhaps thousands. There would have been many cameras and alert cameras and security system outside the Pentagon, probably one of the most secure facilities in the world. And there would also have been ones inside, which would have told us some of how the damage occurred. How many of those videos have we seen? Well, so far the answer is 0, either of the civilian cameras or of the Pentagon. So one of the things that I would go back to again and say is, if you take a look at the early pictures, there was a newsman on site, and there's a round hole there, and it is impossible for an airliner to fit inside that hole and not leave most of it outside. Number 8. The media noted more than 10 calls from hijacked passengers and crew on flights 11, 175, 77, and 93. How many of those were made at altitude? And the question then is, could those cell phone calls have been made at altitude? And I realize that may or may not be the response that a person might get when they first look at the question. Most of us assume that the cell phone made connection and or that there were on board satellite-based or airline-based cell phones that would have been radio connected to the ground. The answer is there were no seatback phones. So the first answer to that is that none of the phone calls could have been made from seatback phones because there were none on any of the 4 planes. So the second part of it is then how many of the cell phones made connection from the various flights. And once the FOIA requests went through, where various people have obtained the records of the radar of those 4 alleged airplanes as they progressed to their targets, the phone calls that matched up with where the plane was at that time was where the phone calls were made when the planes were at altitude. I think most or all of them exceeding 24,000 feet. So how did the cell phones come to make connection with the people on the ground, either to answering machines or to airline centers or to individuals, including Ted Olson and his wife? How were those made? And the answer is they could not have been made. And the reason, and we know that because there was a Canadian test, but almost anybody can test this, that took various cell phones from various companies with various kinds of connections and got into an airplane and attempted to make the calls. And at 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet or 4,000 feet, you could still make connection to the towers. At 8,000 feet, you almost could not. At 12 or 20,000 feet, you couldn't at all. And what is more than that, when an airplane is flying at 400 or 500 miles an hour at altitude, it would have had to have been passed from cell to cell to cell to cell at a rapid fire rate. Many of you, if not all of you who have cell phones, know that every 5 or 6 or 10 miles you have to go on to a different cell, and sometimes those connections don't make. Well, if you're traveling at 500 miles an hour, how well do you think those cell towers would make connection? And the answer is not very well. So for a variety of reasons, those 10 calls were not made at altitude, which calls into question both how those calls were made and from where those calls were made. And there are significant responses to that, including Rebecca Roth, who has some theories about it. I don't necessarily ascribe to all of her theories, but certainly she has a reasonable response to what might have happened in that situation. Number 9, how hot were the steel beams at the Trade Center buildings as a result of the jet fuel at the time of each collapse? Well, there are 2 parts of that. One of them is how hot did those beams get, and the second part of it is how hot were they at the time of the collapse? And my answers that I gave you as an opportunity to respond were hot enough to cause the steel superstructure of each to fail. Second, not hot enough to cause the tops of the towers to fail, hot enough to cause the tops of the towers to fail, thus causing the collapse to the ground. And C, already cooled when the collapses occurred. And the answer is a combination of things. First of all, aviation fuel is essentially heat oil. It is refined heat oil, and it has a maximum burning temperature of 17 or 1800 degrees. The steel in the World Trade Center was certified to well over 2200 and I believe 2500 degrees. So the fires that occur in tall steel buildings, typically office fires, furniture fires, etc., are in the 15, 17, 1800 degree range, assuming that they get a full amount of oxygen. The black clouds, the plumes of black clouds that came out of the 2 towers would indicate that those fires were not at full temperature, but in any case, had they been at full temperature, it would still not have caused the steel to melt, sag, or collapse, to give out. What's more than that, I think if you filled the entire tower with fuel, you still wouldn't get a collapse of the building. And as evidence for that, the architects and engineers of 9/11, if you take a look at their website, you will see a definitive discussion from hundreds and hundreds of sources of some of the finest engineers and architects in the country saying, you know, this just isn't possible. There are, as an aside, there are many 20, 30, 50 fires of steel high-rise buildings that have occurred throughout the world over the last 20 years. And how many of them have failed as a result of those fires? Well, the answer is 3. And they all happened on one day, and that day also concurrently happens to be 9/11. So for 10 or 15 or 20 years before then, and for all of the 16 years since then, there have been fires in tall steel buildings, and none of them have failed. What's more than that, there is some video evidence that one of the 2 towers had completely cooled to the point where a woman who was wandering around and was seen from outside of the towers was putting her hands on them and was walking into the gaping hole where the plane or object had penetrated, and it was clear that those towers were cool at the time. But in any case, it defies credulity to say that a fire on the 70th or 80th or 90th floor would cause all 100 floors to collapse. I know the narrative was that the tops of the towers collapsed, thus causing the rest of them to fail. But first of all, the video does not show that. Secondly, it would not collapse perfectly and squarely, as anyone might expect. If you stack Legos and pop into one of them, first of all, the likelihood is that the top stories would tip over sideways if they were weakened in one side more than the other. And secondly, they wouldn't cause them all to fall. And if you study the thickness and density of the steel, you'll find that it gets denser and denser as you progress down the building in order to carry the weight of the stories above it. So for it to collapse perfectly clear to the ground into its own footprint is almost impossible. The second part of this question, which is not being asked, was how hot was the steel afterwards? And even though the steel had cooled in the towers before the collapse occurred, and that's pretty clear, and of course all but 1 or 2 of the floors would not have been all that hot anyway. For over 90 days there was molten steel in the basements of the Twin Towers that was being dug out, and there's pretty clear evidence that there was steel that was red hot for 90 days, 3 months after the towers fell. So tell me how that airplane fuel did that. Go out and spread a 5-gallon can of oil into some kind of structure, light it, of diesel fuel, light it, and see how long it stays hot. And if it stays hot for 90 days and can keep steel at 2,000 degrees for 90 days, I'd say you got some magic stuff. So please take a look at the 9/11 architects and engineers, and there is some conversation about what did take the towers down, and while it is not within the purview of this conversation to say so, there are people who claim that there's nanothermite, which was government manufactured, government patented, government controlled, and that there are little steel balls all over the dust and debris around 9/11, which is evidence of that, and I think there's probably some case to be made for that. Obviously something chopped the entire towers into 10 or 15 or 20 foot sections, causing it to collapse. There is some evidence of explosions 1 or 2 or 3 stories below the towers as it collapses, as both the north and south towers collapse. And there are people who claim that there are micro nukes, that is nuclear events that occurred, and that there had to be that because the nanothermite could not have damaged the towers enough to do the damage that it did in powdering millions of pounds of concrete. And that there is strontium and some other evidence in the debris that indicates that something like that occurred. Finally, number 10. Who should be held accountable for the 9/11 attacks? And the first answer, and the government's narrative, is the 19 hijackers and, of course, Osama bin Laden. A second answer would be the failed intelligence by the intelligence agencies Certainly if they can identify 19 of them, even though they get 7 or 8 of them wrong, and they can do that within 24 or 48 hours, they should have been able to determine who was there at the outset, but they didn't. It certainly is not the firefighters or police fault or anybody that was an innocent participant that was killed by it, but it is who colluded to do this. And it is a part of what would have to be treated as a conspiracy theory. So let me talk to you a little bit about what is a conspiracy theory, what is conspiracy, and what is a theory. And ever since the 60s, after the Kennedy assassination, there has been the term conspiracy theory, which is used to ward off anyone who might provide an alternative narrative to the government's official narrative. Conspiracy is an evil, unlawful, treacherous, or surreptitious plan formulated in secret by 2 or more people. In law, it is an agreement by 2 or more persons to commit a crime, fraud, or a wrongful act, another wrongful act. Theory means a formulation of apparent relationships of certain observed phenomena which has been verified to some degree. What the administration would have us believe, the Bush administration, was that the phenomena that were obvious on that day form the basis for showing that a conspiracy existed. And as to 9/11, the word conspiracy is not a dirty word, because no matter how it was done, 9/11 was a conspiracy. It was something done criminally, unlawfully, secretly, and treacherously by multiple persons. Now, was it done by Osama bin Laden and 19 Arabs? That's a conspiracy. And the Bush administration would be making its presumption, its theory, its conspiracy theory, that Osama bin Laden and his crew were the culprits, the persons responsible. If it was not carried out as put forth by our administration, and please take note that if any one of these 10 problems does not fit the narrative, then the theory no longer works. The government narrative may also be seen as a hypothesis instead of a theory, which the administration wishes for us to assume to be true without question. All persons who question the narrative of the government may be providing alternate theories, or in lieu of that, they may be doing as I'm doing with this, merely questioning the inconsistencies of the official narrative. So let us be certain as a matter of what is true. There is a conspiracy theory involved with 9/11, no matter which theory you accept. And only those theories, as you might appreciate in science, theories are presented as an explanation for certain phenomena, for events which occur in sequence or appear to occur as a result one of the other. But if there are anomalies in the theory, that is, in other words, if the results are not consistent with the theory, then what a scientist will tell you is we must come up with a better theory. We must come up with an alternative. In this investigation, as it relates to 9/11, and as my questions brought forth, at least as I see it, one must say if the narrative does not fit, if the conspiracy theory of the government, of the administration, of the Bush, of George W. Bush and his bunch does not fit, then we must say that another theory must be brought out. Probably as a matter of fact, all of the theories that are presented as alternatives by the so-called truthers or conspiracy theorists, none of them can be perfectly accurate, because none of these people have the ability to subpoena evidence, to question witnesses, to draw documentary evidence, to have sources of the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, NORAD, NISTRA, the rest of the folks. None of us, including the people that have spent the most time at this, have the ability to do all of that. So it's